In progress.
There we go. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to encourage those of you who are attending our events for the first time to consider becoming a member of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. Please visit us at www.dcslovaks.org for more information. And I'll put that URL in the chat so you can access it there. And let me introduce the speaker. During the communist era, Košice and Eastern Slovakia had a unique mix of ethnic, religious, and working class elements. They all played a role at times as agents, at other times as victims, at key points in Czechoslovakia's history. 1948, the communist takeover, 1968, the Prague Spring, and 1989, the collapse of communism. Professor Mullins will look at the city's Hungarian Calvinists, Rusyn Eastern Rite Catholics, and steelworkers at Košice's Eastern Slovak Steelworks, today US Steel, and explain how they were significant in each era. By examining these historical participants, she will show how Košice's experiences during Czechoslovakia's 20th century upheavals were different from the experiences of both Prague and Bratislava. Originally hailing from Orlando, Florida, Marty Manor Mullins lived and taught around the world before settling with her husband in Northwest Montana. After completing her bachelor's degree in secondary education at the University of Central Florida, she embarked on a teaching opportunity in Košice, Slovakia, which would become her home for 7 years. She eventually returned to the United States to enter the University of Washington's doctoral program in history and was awarded a Fulbright Mellon Fellowship that enabled her to complete her dissertation research in Slovakia. After earning her Ph.D. in 2013, she taught at Tulane University in New Orleans. She currently teaches history and political science at Flathead Valley Community College in Kalispell, Montana. Her published work focuses on East Central European history, politics, and urban life. In addition to teaching, Dr. Mullins serves on the board of the Slovak Studies Association and is a regular participant in the Slovak American Society of Washington's online Advanced Slovak Conversation Group. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Mullins.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you all today on a Saturday afternoon. I'm amazed so many of you are here, and I see some familiar names and faces. So thank you so much for allowing me to join a long list of illustrious speakers who have taken part in the speaker series here. Well, I'm excited today to introduce you to Košice's distinct subversives. And in doing so, I will explain the turning points that Košice and Czechoslovakia experienced under communism in 1948, 68, and 89. You might even see some loose parallels today with the situation going on in Ukraine. Very tragic. And of course, Košice is only a 1 hour drive from the Ukrainian border, about 50 miles. You know, Mark Twain famously said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that's what we're definitely seeing play out in front of us today. So I'm going to share my screen here, excuse me, so that you can view my presentation. All right. Okay, so hopefully, yes, you can see my screen. All right. Okay. Well, I realize I'm preaching to the choir here and that most of you are very familiar with Slovakia and Košice's location. But for anyone who's not, this is Košice here in Eastern Slovakia. Again, just an hour drive from the Ukrainian border. It's the second largest city in Slovakia, with a population of approximately 239,000. The majority population, of course, is Slovak, but there are also significant Hungarian and Ukrainian minorities in Slovakia, as well as in particular in Košice. Košice also has a large Roma population, actually one of the largest in East Central Europe. And US Steel is the largest employer in Košice, buying the old communist steel mill, Eastern Slovak Steelworks, which we'll talk about today. They purchased that in the year 2000. And so US Steel being definitely the largest employer in the city. Well, I want to talk about the turning points in Czechoslovak history. 20th century Czechoslovak history famously turns on the hinges of upheavals that the country experienced roughly every 20 years. So we begin, of course, from 1918 to 1938 with the first Czechoslovak Republic, which existed only for 20 years before succumbing to pressure from Nazi Germany and breaking up into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and a Slovak puppet state that was governed by Josef Tiso during the Second World War. Well, when the Second World War ended in 1945, the country reunited under the presidency of Edvard Beneš. But in 1948, just 3 years after the war, the communists consolidated power in Czechoslovakia and effectively organized a coup to take over the government. They continued to rule for the next 40 years. But 20 years after 48, we have the Prague Spring liberalization period and then the Soviet invasion. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with 1968, when Alexander Dubček, who was a Slovak, became the general secretary of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. And when he came into power in January of 68, he ushered in a liberalization program that allowed degrees of free market reform, freedom of speech and the press, and a loosening of travel restrictions known as socialism with a human face. However, Moscow did not like what they believed to be a counter-revolution, is what they called it, threatening their grip on power in Czechoslovakia. And as a result, they were afraid they would lose power across the Eastern European satellite states. So the Warsaw Pact conducted a surprise invasion in Czechoslovakia on August 21st, 1968, to put down this liberalization or counter-revolution going on in Czechoslovakia. For the next 20 years, Czechoslovakia remained one of the most tightly controlled satellite states in Eastern Europe. Well, all of that changed in November of 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell down and a wave of demonstrations broke out across the region. And the Slovak contingent and Czechoslovaks joined into that in November in what's known as the Velvet Revolution. The regime was ousted in Czechoslovakia by December of '89. So my own research has been driven by the question, what was going on in Košice in Eastern Slovakia during these turning point years? How was the Eastern Slovak experience different from what was going on in Prague and Bratislava? And I discovered that there were three groups in Košice and its surrounding area that distinguish its experience. First, the Hungarian minority, the Eastern Rite Catholics, and the Steelworkers. So today I want to elevate these voices of these three regional collectives who could easily be described as underdogs. But they were savvy underdogs, skillfully working top-down mandates to their own advantage, yet within, of course, the prescribed parameters. But it was their agency that enabled their survival. And yet beyond surviving, they actually managed to transform not only their individual situations, but at times even local and national ones. So I'll introduce several examples here right away, and then we'll cover those one by one. To begin with, the Hungarian minority. They insincerely conformed to the 1946 mandate to re-Slovakize, or in other words, assimilate to the Slovak population, or else leave the city or be kicked out. Nevertheless, when ethnic identity was no longer an issue under communism, a majority of those who falsely claimed to be Slovak after the war identified again as Hungarians on later census. So that's one example of a subversive group. Similarly, the Eastern Rite Catholics converted to Orthodoxy in 1950 when the communists abolished their denomination, forcing them to become Orthodox. But for 18 years, they secretly continued their religious practices of christenings and marriage ceremonies that they just took underground. And then they rallied in '68 when they had the chance and actually successfully reinstated their denomination. Well, beyond expedient opportunism, Košice's steelworkers acted as agents both in 1968 and '89. So in the wake of that Warsaw Pact invasion in '68, they worked Saturday shifts known as Dubček shifts to ensure no lack of production due to their colleagues participating in protests. Furthermore, the steel mill had a newspaper that was not yet occupied by the incoming forces. So they went to press twice daily to get out the news of what was happening in Czechoslovakia right after that invasion. And they had a readership that extended far beyond Eastern Slovakia. Well, despite harsh measures leveled against those steelworkers who did these kind of very risky moves in '68, there was a significant minority that decided to go ahead and resist the regime again 20 years later in 1989. And at that point, Eastern Slovak Steel had 24,000 employees. It was the largest firm in all of Slovakia. And so their support during the general strike and in subsequent demonstrations significantly contributed to the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. Well, let's begin with our first group, which is the Hungarians. It's important to remember that Košice was actually not part of Slovakia during the Second World War. It had been ceded to Hungary for the duration of the war because Hungary had allied with Nazi Germany, and Germany had decided to reward them by giving Hungary back southern Slovakia, which included Košice. Well, after the war, when Czechoslovakia was reunited, local Germans and Hungarians were not popular, as you can imagine. Many Czechs and Slovaks considered them to be responsible for the breakup of the First Republic and considered them agents of the Nazi regime. Even President Beneš declared in 1945, he said, "Our state will be a state of nations, a state of only Czechs and Slovaks and no one else." So his post-war administration actively sought to eliminate the Hungarian minority from Košice and southern Slovakia through a process known as re-Slovakization. So here's just a brief map of, this is southern Slovakia that was ceded back to Hungary during the war. Here we have Ruthenia, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and Košice sits about right here. So it experienced World War II under Hungarian rule. So when Czechoslovakia was reunited after the war, again, those Hungarians living here were very threatened, felt very threatened, and they sincerely were threatened. In fact, there was an effort to eliminate them, as well as the Germans living in Czechoslovakia, in a post-war ethnic cleansing process. The German minority, which counted to over 3 million Germans, was en masse expelled and kicked out of the country, whereas over 500,000, over 500,000 Hungarians had to choose between either taking part in a population exchange back to Hungary, being deported to the Czech lands, or re-Slovakizing. So you can see here how the Beneš administration after the war was forcibly trying to make Košice Slovak. In other words, get rid of those Hungarian elements and any German elements, and force folks to re-Slovakize, assimilate, or leave. Well, these measures affected one group of Hungarians in a way that dealt a blow to the entire population. I'm going to go back to that slide. And that is the Hungarian Calvinist or Reformed Church in Košice was actually one of the largest Reformed congregations in all of Slovakia, totaling 6,000 members in 1944. Well, this congregation, which is still going, and you can see a picture of it here, the church, it dates back to the year 1644, and it was almost entirely made up of Hungarians. But due to these anti-Hungarian policies that were enacted after the war, this congregation was targeted. In fact, church leaders in the Reformed Church pointed to re-Slovakization as the major reason that the entire denomination suffered a dramatic decrease across Slovakia. In particular, re-Slovakization affected the Hungarian believers when liturgical language was restricted to Slovak, which of course, as many of you know, is very different than Hungarian. Their property was confiscated. Many Hungarians were targets of their neighbors as well as the state, as folks were looking to reappropriate property, whether movable assets or land, to themselves, because again, they accused the Hungarians of being responsible for the breakup of Czechoslovakia before the war. The state also refused to pay Hungarian clergy salaries, and those clergy were not allowed to teach or correspond with each other in Hungarian. So these represent just the everyday repercussions of the post-war policy that Slovak and Hungarian congregants and brethren, they had to grapple with. They shared the same religious confession, but stood on opposing ethnic sides. So I'll read a quote here that describes how the Hungarian brethren, the Calvinists, dealt with this situation. This comes from a history of Košice recently published called Remembering the City. It says, in the course of this re-Slovakization campaign, some 435,000 people submitted petitions or applications to become Slovak, of which the Slovak authorities accepted 362,679. Most of the applicants considered re-Slovakization the only means to remain where they were born. The book also notes that Košice changed hands 5 times in the course of one generation. And a part of the citizens, that was from 1918 to 1945. They say a part of the citizens of this multilingual city always lost during these changes, while another part tried to align themselves with the changes and challenged language and nationalism, changed their language and nationalist affiliation during official surveys. Many of the bilingual dual identity citizens could actually turn Czechoslovak from one year to the next, and then 2 decades later turn back to Hungarians if the authorities wanted them to do so. So many Hungarians in Košice, including the Calvinists, insincerely reported as Slovaks after the war so as not to be deported or lose their property. In this way, they managed to remain in their hometown Yet if they wanted to continue attending their local Calvinist church, they had to do so in a foreign language. Of course, this is quite difficult for many, especially the older population, to worship in a language that is so foreign from your own. However, these Hungarians also identified as Hungarian again on the 1960 census and fought as well in 1968 to be a recognized minority, and they made some gains. So our first example of subversives. Well, we also have the Eastern Rite Catholics. These are the second group that we'll discuss today. And they, the Eastern Rite faith is known as Greek Catholicism in Slovak. It's a rite within the Catholic Church, similar to the Roman Catholic Church in that it looks to the Vatican as its head, yet its liturgy largely resembles that of the Orthodox Church. Well, similar to the Reformed Calvinist Church in Košice, the Eastern Rite Church in Slovakia was not primarily comprised of Slovaks, but rather Rusyns and Ukrainians, who were also concentrated in and around Košice and Eastern Slovakia. Many Eastern Rite Catholics were, and even are today, ethnic Rusyns or Ruthenians, and they live in what is today Northeast Slovakia and Western Ukraine. So I'm going to take you back to a map here. So this segment of the first Czechoslovak Republic was actually ceded back to Stalin by President Beneš after the Second World War. So Czechoslovakia lost this region. This is the region in here, including part of Eastern Slovakia, where many Rusyns, Ruthenians, even ethnic Ukrainians live, and certainly where the core of Eastern Rite or Greek Catholicism is located. My guess is that many of the Ukrainians, so again, this today is the Ukrainian border, and my guess is that many of the Ukrainians that we're seeing come to Slovakia as refugees now have either family or perhaps religious ties with folks in Eastern Slovakia who are Eastern Rite Catholics. All right. Well, just as the post-war Beneš administration attempted to make Košice Slovak, not Hungarian, the communist regime, which of course replaced the Beneš administration in 1948, wanted to make Košice communist. In other words, oppress religious faiths and even single out some for elimination, which they did with the Eastern Rite Catholics. The communists also wanted to make the city proletariat, you could say. They wanted to transform that image of Košice from being a bourgeois, kind of wealthy city, and indeed it was. There were many Jewish and Hungarian business owners who were quite wealthy, and the city had a reputation for being quite well off. Well, of course, the communists wanted to change that, make it a proletariat city, and so they established a steel mill and then drew in the population from the surrounding countryside, lured them in to work in the steel mill by building, of course, blocks of flats all around the city that had running water and hot water and indoor plumbing and all that good stuff. So again, after the Second World War, we see efforts to homogenize the population from the top down. Well, as I mentioned, communists wanted to make Eastern Slovakia communist, and in particular, they targeted the Eastern Rite. And they targeted them because the Eastern Rite had left the Orthodox Church way back in the late 16th century, but had subjected themselves to the influence of the Vatican. And particularly in this Stalinist era, Stalin died in 1953, but the Eastern Rite was abolished in 1950. And there had been particularly tense relations between the Vatican and Stalin, and of course the Kremlin. And Stalin was looking to eliminate any churches that had direct ties to the Vatican so that they wouldn't influence folks under his rule. Another reason why the communists targeted the Eastern Rite was because they actively resisted the communists during and after the Second World War. After the war, they actually openly associated with the Democratic Party. This was before the communist coup. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the USSR and the Russian Orthodox Church were hostile to the Eastern Rite. And it had already been eliminated in Poland, Ukraine, and Romania. So the precedent was set. Well, the way the communists were going to go about this was to liquidate or abolish the Eastern Rite in Slovakia, forcing all believers and priests to convert or transfer to the Orthodox faith. Well, the Eastern Rite Christians did not receive this mandate well. In fact, they had quite a reputation. Parishioners physically attacked regime agents and their vehicles when they visited Eastern Slovak villages in order to force believers and clergy to sign documents indicating their pledged conversion to Orthodoxy. I want to read to you a revealing excerpt from the archival document of the Communist Department for Church Affairs. And this account reveals two communist agents who came to the Eastern Slovak village of Královce in May of 1950 to force that village priest to convert to Orthodoxy. So these agents, they were smart. They parked their car on the edge of the village so as not to alert the villagers of their presence. They proceeded on foot to the parish, but realized when they got there that the priest was out of town. So the agents said they'd return later. Well, a crowd of about 30 villagers, mostly women, started shouting. They said, quote, "What did you come for? We know that you came so that you could take away the priest and the church. And you are waiting in vain because we broke your car and you have to go on foot." Well, the drama continued when Comrade Filakovsky, the area's church secretary, asked those present if the village had an office for the head of the city national committee. At this, one of those present shouted, "You know very well where it is. You were here about 4 times." One man, approximately 35 to 40 years old, threw stones and kicked them. And at the same time, someone sounded the village alarm, and they continued to beat these communist agents. People were calling for them to kill the agents or throw them into the water. And about 150 started following them, mostly women and children. This caught the attention of a neighboring village, which also started following the procession, which shouted, "Kill those godless ones." Well, the crowd even brought out the official papers announcing this transfer of all Eastern Rite Catholics to Orthodoxy and tore them up in front of the two communist cadres. Well, with that, the crowd followed them out of town. And I read this account because it demonstrates the amount of antagonism Eastern Rite believers displayed against the communist regime that was trying to convert them and take away their priests to the Orthodox faith. Well, although the communists managed, of course, to succeed in abolishing the faith in 1950, many believers continued for the next 18 years to secretly replicate their own versions of christenings and marriage ceremonies. Additionally, at this time, back in 1950, many were of Rusyn ethnicity, and they were obligated at that time by the regime to relinquish their Rusyn identity in favor of either a Ukrainian or a Slovak one. Again, forced assimilation. Well, rather than associate with what they perceived as, quote, Russian Ukrainianism, they expediently classified themselves as Slovak, rather insincerely again, until the 1968 Prague Spring, when they pushed for the Rusyn ethnicity to be restored. Well, also in 1968, The Eastern Rite saw a window of opportunity during Dubček's period of liberalization to push the government to reinstate their denomination, which had literally been abolished. They came into conflict, however, with the local Orthodox when the Eastern Rite started violently seizing back their church properties, which had since become that of the Orthodox, both the church buildings, the interior, all the elements, all of this was up for grabs in a literal brawl that was taking place across Eastern Slovakia in 1968. In fact, on June 5th of 68, the chair of Košice's Regional National Committee sent Gustav Husak, who was then deputy chair of the government, sent him an urgent memo saying the situation between believers of the Orthodox Church and the Greek Catholic churches in our region in the current period is very heightened. I ask you please for an expedited handling of this problem. Well, unbelievably, the regime actually reinstated the Eastern Rite Church in 1968, largely because of the degree of violence that broke out in Eastern Slovakia as these believers started seizing back their churches. One person was actually killed, many were injured, and a large number of sacred objects and church properties were damaged. They also reinstated the denomination because high-profile and lay believers from various denominations publicly and repeatedly pushed the regime to reinstate the denomination. This reinstatement was one of only 2 reforms of the Prague Spring era to survive the ensuing normalization period of hardline communism. The other being Czech and Slovak Federation. So really what they accomplished was remarkable. Additionally, in 1969, the Rusyns won official recognition of their ethnicity. And that year, the government granted minorities, including Hungarians, the right to at least educate children in their own languages. So again, we see the underdogs acting against religious and ethnic co-optation by assuming transient identities and secretly continuing forbidden practices in order to function in an authoritarian state until the moment was ripe for opposition. Well, that brings us to the steelworkers, and I wanted to share with you first a few pictures here of Košice's downtown square. This is known as Liberator Square, and move my photo over here. So this square was established after the Second World War and to honor the Soviets who bled and died to liberate Slovakia and Košice from the Nazis. And you can see there the hammer and sickle emblems, although they're in disarray because in 1968, locals turned on this central monument downtown. So just to kind of give you a little bit of backdrop on the steelworkers, thanks to the expansion of the steel mill, by 1968, Košice had become the fastest growing city in all of Czechoslovakia from 1961 to 67. And over 17,000 of the city's inhabitants were employed at the steel mill by that time. So before the Soviet invasion, which happened on August 21st in 68, thousands of steelworkers and even chief factory managers had signed papers and petitions calling for, quote, socialism, alliance, sovereignty, and freedom. This was a gutsy move to go on the record against the regime, even if it was during those 8 months from January to August of 68 that were kind of a thaw of the hardline communism. However, on the night of August 20 to 21, Warsaw Pact troops from East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union crossed the Czechoslovak borders from multiple directions And this maneuver was the largest military operation in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And I know we're hearing a lot about that today as what's happening in Ukraine as well. A total of 30 died in the Slovak part of the country, while 108 were killed, approximately 500 seriously injured, and hundreds more slightly injured in the entire country of Czechoslovakia. Well, here in Košice, the tanks came in and citizens awoke that morning at 5:20 a.m. to the Czechoslovak radio broadcasting the following report. And here you see a prime example of a misinformation campaign happening even then. The radio broadcast said, quote, "At the request of leading figures of our republic and because of the threat to our country and socialism, Warsaw Pact armies are arriving to help." Okay, so obviously skewing the narrative with false misinformation. Well, the public wasn't buying it. By 9 a.m., a crowd of angry residents had assembled at this downtown Liberators Square to express their disgust. Tanks and trucks by then occupied the square. And this, of course, to me is very akin to Kiev's Independence Square, the Maidan, where the Ukrainians, of course, protested in 2004 and again in 2013. So forcibly and effectively, many there were killed. But I'm showing you pictures from the downtown Košice Square taken by local eyewitness Gene Fostner. And because this square was a critical intersection upon entering the city, and because its hammer and sickle insignia signified the communist regime, it naturally became the focal point for civilian protest. At 12:30 p.m., Warsaw Pact troops shot into the crowd that had gathered there, and 16-year-old Michael Hamrak, who was an apprentice at the Steelworks, was the first victim. Košice registered 7 fatalities, 61 gunshot wounds to Bratislava's 6 fatalities and 10 non-fatal bullet wounds. 2 of the 7 killed in Košice actually worked at the steel mill. Well, interestingly, when they began to talk, the people, some of these Soviet or Warsaw Pact troops, including, this is a guy from a truck, some Soviet soldiers were under the impression that their maneuvers were intended to put down a civil war or violent counter-revolution that was breaking out in Czechoslovakia. The invasion had been justified by the communists as brotherly help. So again, more misinformation. But interestingly, even after August 21st and the invasion, steelworkers continued to support Dubček's liberalization in very resourceful yet risky ways. In the early days of the invasion, the newspaper, again, went to press twice daily to compensate for other presses that had been shut down. They worked Saturdays to participate in what they called Dubček's shifts, which were overtime work shifts to ensure that there was no lack of production due to the fact that so many workers were out protesting in the city. That could have been used against them. They also willingly gave their names to reporters as they pledged support to Dubček in newspaper interviews. Yet these public expressions of opposition to the regime came with consequences that would cause many of them who retained their positions at the steel mill to reconsider 20 years later when they were asked to participate in the Velvet Revolution of '89. And I wanted to show you this I found on the Slovak Spectator this week. This is Bratislava's Slovene Soviet World War II memorial that has been painted in Ukrainian colors in protest. That is just this week. So again, locals definitely recognizing what they consider to be Soviet memorials and defacing them as needed. Well, the steelworkers did join in the 1989 Velvet Revolution in communism, against communism, but not at first. In fact, approximately 80% of them chose not to resist. Around 1/5 did join the revolution. That was around 5,000 of them, despite having much to lose. I recently published a study that examined the official demands articulated by Košice locals, including Eastern Slovakia's steelworkers, theater groups, and even ethnic minority groups, including the Hungarians. Well, by examining these demands and the language used there, I concluded that what drove these groups to risk brutal reprisal by the communist regime in those November days was that they were more motivated by anti-communist ideological values than by what they stood to lose, not only physically, but even materially, if the regime imprisoned or killed them. Yet those who resisted were in the minority. Even among the 24,000 strong Eastern Slovak Steelworks employees, only 20%, again, joined the revolution. So why didn't more join? Well, number one, a primary reason is that Eastern Slovak steel employees remembered the consequences that had happened to their fellow employees who had publicly opposed the 1968 Soviet invasion. In the wake of that invasion, many of those who had publicly opposed the regime were censured, some were arrested, others demoted, blacklisted, or worse, their families were targeted. Some of their children were not allowed to attend university. I know a gentleman in Košice, Roman Jasensky, who himself was the child of a father who publicly resisted the regime and a very high-ranking communist at that time. And Roman himself was never allowed to go to university. Listen to the following quote from the chair of the steel mills revolutionary trade union at the time. His name is Dimitar Struk. And regarding to the question as to whether or not to join the strike, he replied, quote, "We think there's no reason to strike." And when the journalist asked that their names be connected to their opinions, he stated this: "We have experience from 2 decades ago. We have children, families. We are afraid that by your public expression of our opinions, we would be targeted." And blast furnace operator Stefan Hudachka added, "Until now, people are afraid to publicly tell the truth because party functionaries wanted to hear only what they wanted to hear. Nevertheless," he concluded, "my conviction matches the students." So he did go on the record against the regime. Well, the second reason that the majority of Košice steelworkers did not strike was because they were benefiting big time from economic advantages associated with their working class status. So in my interview with anthropologist Juraj Buzalka, he emphasized that steel laborers in 1980s Czechoslovakia enjoyed a privileged status. As workers specially educated in not only producing basic steel, but finished, sophisticated products, they enjoyed perks unknown to the average Czechoslovak. And examples of such perks included paid summer and winter vacations at local swimming and ski resorts, free public transport passes, regular tickets to the wellness spa, access to the brand new hospital built near the steel mill, etc. Buzalka added, they earned very good money and were taken care of exceptionally well when compared with other workers in other professions. He actually painted the following picture of everyday life for a Eastern Slovak steelworker in the late 80s. He said, quote, "Your parents have a good pension. The road in your village was just paved. You earn more than a university professor. You can't vacation just anywhere, but you certainly could vacation in Romania. You could even express your anti-communist opinions to an extent because you were not a teacher or one who influenced others." So in short, the workers at the steel mill had nothing to complain about, at least regarding their wages and benefits. So why would they be on the front lines of protest? Well, that leads us to the obvious question. What then did mobilize the participation of the roughly 20% of steelworkers who did participate in the revolution? Based on an examination of their demands, it becomes clear that they were inspired to correct a deficient political system that had enforced severe restrictions on everyday life. So I want to read to you just a sampling of the demands that the steelworkers posted in '89. They said they wanted to abolish the constitutionally mandated leading role of the Communist Party in society. Number 3, this is their number 3, expedite implementation of free and democratic elections. Number 4, pass legislation permitting free press and free exchange of information. And 5, expedite roundtable discussions between all politicians and societal elements. And the list goes on. So when I examined these demands, as well as information coming from other sources, including posters and journals and newspaper reports, I determined that those who took to the streets did so because they were motivated by ideological motivations. In other words, they wanted to oppose communism, even if it meant being thrown in prison or their families being targeted. And this analysis is actually corroborated by James Krapfel's examination of November and December '89 posters, flyers, speeches, and other materials, where he also found calls for, quote, democracy, freedom, nonviolence, fairness, and humanness. He noted that this language was far more prevalent than calls for lower taxes or better working conditions. So the fact that over 1/5 of Eastern Slovakia's advantaged labor collective were concerned enough with ideals to jeopardize being stripped of their jobs, the associated perks, or even their children's academic prospects points to the conclusion that they protested not for, but in spite of the possibility of losing these generous benefits. To them, ideological principles overshadowed economic anxieties and even worries about their own security. It's actually a wonder at all that 5,000 of them took place in this general strike. And here you see downtown Main Street, Hlavna ulica in Košice. You see this is St. Elizabeth's Cathedral and a picture of the general strike that day. You also see another communist monument that has totally been defaced in 1989. Well, and here's, one more picture. This was taken at the time outside of the Technical University in Košice. It reads, Košice wants Havel, meaning Václav Havel. And let me just summarize here for you. Košice steelworkers, of course, were influential in both '68 and '89. And as the largest labor workforce in all of Slovakia in '89, their support during that general strike and in subsequent demonstrations significantly added a lot of gusto to the Velvet Revolution momentum. And in conclusion, and yes, this is a picture of the statue of Lenin that was quickly deposed. This is right outside of what's known as Bielý dom in Košice, or the White House, which is the chief administrative building for the government. So they wasted no time in deposing Lenin. In fact, this flyer here is by one of the original political parties that comes about in the wake of the Velvet Revolution. And it says in small print there, a chance for Slovakia, a chance for you. But in conclusion, Košice's Hungarian Calvinists, Eastern Rite Catholics, and Rusyn minority, as well as steelworkers, chose to act within the prescribed parameters, but to shape their own destiny. They behaved opportunistically and brought about change at individual, local, and even national level. We can only wish the same courage and fortune to the Ukrainians who now take the role of underdog in the 21st century. Thank you.
you.
So I'll open
Marty.
it up here to questions.
I see one question in the chat. What age were those workers who supported the 1989 revolution? Were they younger with less to lose?
It's a good question. In a lot of cases they were, because the youth, of course, didn't really remember 1968. And youth are naturally more impetuous and risk takers. Nevertheless, there was a significant number of middle-aged folks who said, no holds barred, I'm going to risk it.
And another question popped up. Can you describe or refer me to a map that would show the route taken by Soviet tanks through Slovakia? Did they pass through Rusyn villages in the northeast?
My understanding would be yes. So again, the Warsaw Pact, there were 5 Warsaw Pact countries that simultaneously descended on Czechoslovakia from all directions. So I believe I said East Germany, Poland. So that would be your Rusyn Northeast Slovakia connection, Bulgaria, Hungary, and the USSR. So, I mean, it was a simultaneous operation.
And Helen asks, did students play much of a role?
Yeah, students in both 68 and 89 were absolutely pivotal. In fact, in comparison to, say, the 89 revolution that took place in Bratislava, where you had more established dissidents, more adult figures who had been imprisoned, who kind of led the revolution. In Košice, it was student-led, absolutely, in those early days. And then they joined as well with the kind of underground and intellectuals in Košice, and connected with Prague rather than Bratislava in 89. So that really sets Košice's experience of 89 apart from Bratislava.
Does anyone else have any questions for Marty? Let's see, here's another. Dubček was first secretary of the Slovak Communist Party for 5 years before he became first secretary of the Czechoslovak Party. Have you found any evidence of liberalization in Košice between 1963 and 1968?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Krapfel. We're honored to have you with us today. My answer to that would be, I actually just reviewed a recent anthology of Dubček for the Slovakia Journal. It's published in Czech and Slovak languages. And based on that collection of essays, which is really groundbreaking and recent scholarship on Dubček, it appears to me he was more fighting for Slovakia as a whole, as opposed to just Košice, but absolutely in his earlier roles before he became head of the entire country, he was advocating for Slovaks to be on par with Czechs. He himself being a Slovak and recognizing that the country needed to be federalized, not just everything coming out of Prague. So that would be my answer to that.
Okay, another question. Did people travel from Bratislava or Prague to support the Velvet Revolution in Košice, and vice versa from Košice to Bratislava and Prague?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually a colleague that I taught at a Slovak high school or gymnasium in Košice called Šrobarova Gymnasium. And one of my colleagues there was himself a student at the time of the Velvet Revolution. And he told me all about how the trains waived any fees for young people who were going to help, different cities basically peacefully revolt against the regime. Now, Košice got pretty offended when the Bratislava train came, supposedly to teach Košice how to revolt. And they wrote about this in the published work at the time, and I've written about this in a recent article known as Forgotten Velvet. So Košice was quite miffed because they said, look, we've already been to Prague and back, and we are communicating with Prague, who of course was really, the leader of the Civic Forum movement against communism. And so, yeah, there was a lot of train riding, going back and forth to support each other. One more note about that. On the Bratislava train that came to Košice, there were many actors from Bratislava who were known nationally. And actors actually took a really influential role, actors and playwrights in the Czechoslovak version of the '89 revolution. And this, of course, reminds me of Zelensky in Ukraine today, who is a former actor and just has that. I was watching him in a news conference this week, and I thought, I know he's exhausted and not sleeping, but he just seems to thrive on that interaction with the audience. And maybe that comes from his acting and comedian career days. Did Dubček get involved with the Velvet Revolution in Košice? He did come visit. Yes, he did. And I believe there was some talk that, well, gee, should Dubček be our leader again? And the overwhelming understanding was that Václav Havel was really who was wanted, but Havel supported Dubček. Dubček supported Havel. Yeah, they were both there in person. Mm-hmm.
Another question, shall I read it for you?
Sure, that'd be great.
Sure. Did ROH, the trade unions, take a unified stand one way or another during 1989? Were they divided? And if so, how much? Did the Kovorobotnici connect with other metal workers in Slovakia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, wondering if the steelworkers and the subsidiary industry trade unions, whether or not they united against the communists. I'm sure there were factions that were not ready to do that. I can think of even a group at the university in Košice, the legal students, for example. They were like, we're not going on the record against this. Maybe that's because they're, studying to be lawyers. They're naturally cautious. But by and large, a lot of the trade unions and workers did come together and unite. They knew they'd be stronger. Again, communism so dependent on the proletariat, and of course, Eastern Slovak Steelworks having 24,000. That's a huge conglomerate. Again, some of their demands, I'll read you another demand. It says, abolish Communist Party organizations in the workplace. Only allow trade unions to represent workers' interests. We pronounce our agreement with the resignation of the leadership of the Central Committee of Trade Unions, above all, because they were installed without membership support. So again, there was only one option to vote for as a political party. That was the Communist Party, and to be in if you were a union person, and they wanted more democracy there too.
Another question. When did Václav Havel first travel to Košice after the Velvet Revolution?
I am not sure exactly, but I can see in my mind's eye a picture of him right downtown at the State Library balcony, overseeing the crowds cheering. And it would have been spring of 1990 is my guess. He was, of course, leading the group and the playwrights and the theater actors in Prague at the Magic Lantern during November and December of '89.
Good questions.
Oh, Kropfel. Okay, great. Dr. Kropfel says he did make it there in December '89. Good.
Okay. Someone else said, I recall when Havel came to Bratislava in 1991, some in the crowd were hostile towards him.
Could be. Again, everyone in 89, it was there on the main square, downtown Main Street in Košice, and shaking their keys. That was the big way to, instead of clapping, you're shaking your keys. And I happened to be living in Košice when Havel died, and remember the immediate memorial that was informally set up with just candles and flowers. And it was cold. I want to say it might have been December. And, just an outpouring of respect for Havel. So I'm sure he wasn't liked by everyone, but I see, was there much sympathy with Polish workers? Yeah, during the strikes there. Especially among steelworkers, I'm sure, but I don't think in Czechoslovakia they could not express that. Again, Czechoslovakia being such a tightly controlled satellite state, and Eastern Slovaks not even getting as much news, you could say, as perhaps what was filtering into Bratislava. Folks living in Bratislava, even under communism, could pipe in news from Vienna across the Danube River, and were perhaps a little more in the know. Yeah, Helen asks, what's been the relationship between Bratislava and Košice historically? Well, if you want to talk about underdogs of underdogs, I would say the Eastern Slovaks would fit that description. So, even in the Czechoslovak relationship, the Slovaks were traditionally and historically the underdog compared to the Czechs. The Czechs had the industry, the wealth, the education. Slovaks in general were more rural, agrarian, less educated. And the perception in Slovakia itself is that the further east you go, the behinder you get. A lot of folks in Western Slovakia really look down on Eastern Slovakia and Košice as being more of a backwater region. There's always been that rivalry between the first and second city, and Košice bears a lot of grudge, I would say, against Bratislava, thinking that, Bratislava holds the purse strings, the money goes there first, they determine how it's allocated. Eastern Slovakia has a much higher unemployment rate historically, even recently, than Western Slovakia. So, there's definitely some rivalry there. And that's why, in part, Košice has notably affiliated itself more with Prague, rather than to say we submit to Bratislava. Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone out there?
Beverly, I see you there. You'd have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Marty, would you say that that's still true today, that the people of Košice feel closer to Prague than Bratislava?
In a lot of ways, yes. They see Prague as a cosmopolitan city akin to their own. Again, Košice is a very multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-confessional city. Bratislava, a bit more homogenous, although of Slovak, although a significant Hungarian population. There's nothing official. They certainly would, they're proud to associate with each other. But yes, there's still an East-West kind of grudge, I guess you could say.
And what about Central Slovakia, around Banska Bystrica?
Yeah, if they're more East Central, they probably associate better with the Eastern Slovaks, as opposed to if they're like in Žilina and the Western part of that central area, they would certainly affiliate more with Bratislava. But again, the country is so small, it's the size of West Virginia.
Yeah.
So again, if you have a hockey game or anything like that, you've got the whole country rooting for you. And the thing about Eastern Slovakia is, it takes a lot as an Eastern Slovak to be able to get out, to have the education, the skills, the training. And I would argue that that's why a lot of even leaders across Slovakia have come out of Eastern Slovakia, some for better and worse. We have Rudolf Schuster, we have Zurinda, they are Eastern Slovak. So, some of them have really made a name for themselves.
Is the land in Eastern Slovakia just poorer, more mountainous than the Western Slovakia? Is that part of it?
The Carpathian Mountains do, they're really kind of north central and even Eastern Slovakia. I think a lot of it too has just been Bratislava's proximity to Vienna in the west. So plus Eastern Slovakia and Southern Slovakia, including Košice, was really, under Hungarian rule and had to fight to overcome that as well. So I'm reading here that according to Google Alert, Slovakia, more than 90,000 Ukrainians have crossed into Slovakia. Yeah, and if you go to the Slovak Studies Association website, I can type that in here. We've actually posted a statement with a list of refugee aid organizations in Slovakia proper that are trying to help, as well as other aid organizations. So type that in here.
Marty, could I just chime in for a moment?
Of course.
Just a little bit of personal experience. I have a cousin who trained as an actress and was an actress until she stepped out and did other things. And she trained, and she's from Bratislava. Well, she's from Martin, actually, but she trained in Košice and she performed in Košice. And the theater in Košice, in her circles, was held to be as pretty much as distinguished as the National Theater in Bratislava. On the other hand, I have heard comments in my own family that go along with this perception that, well, Eastern Slovakia, they're just not up to what we're doing in the West. So both attitudes exist.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, and even the Hungarian theater in Košice is quite accomplished, especially historically. When you look at the old Hungarian Empire, Košice was the third largest and most important city after Buda and Pest, which we know as Budapest, but Košice being number 3. And they had a very illustrious theater that was visited by very famous actors and actresses, even in the 19th century. So, yeah. Well, thank you guys for your interest and your questions and your attention on a Saturday afternoon. I'm very impressed. I feel like I should give you a quiz, but I think you'd all pass. So
Thank you.
Thank you. I've downloaded your list of resources from the chat. So I'll see if I can get that posted on our website. So if anyone missed that, then maybe you can find it on our website, which I did put in the chat. Once again, it's dcslovaks.org. And thank you again for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. And I hope everyone has a pleasant rest of your afternoon. And hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you.